In the autumn of 1942, an American submarine captain lined up a Japanese freighter in his periscope, calculated the angle, and fired. The torpedo ran straight and true. It struck the hull dead center, and nothing happened. No explosion, no flash, no column of water. Just the dull thud of 800 pounds of American steel bouncing off an enemy ship like a rock thrown at a wall. He surfaced that night and radioed Pearl Harbor. He was told, in essence, that he had missed, that he needed to improve his aim. He had not missed, neither had the dozens of other submarine commanders filing nearly identical reports across the Pacific. Torpedoes running too deep, torpedoes failing to detonate, entire war patrols coming home with nothing to show for weeks of danger. For nearly 2 years, the United States Navy sent its submarine force into combat armed with a weapon that did not work, and for nearly 2 years, the men responsible for that weapon refused to believe their own product was the problem. This is not a story about bad luck, or inexperienced crews, or the fog of war. This is the story of an institution that built a torpedo, refused to test it properly, and then blamed the men who had to fire it, until one admiral decided to prove them wrong himself. The weapon did not fail in a vacuum. It failed inside a system built to protect itself. The Bureau of Ordnance was the branch of the United States Navy responsible for every gun, shell, mine, and torpedo in the fleet. It did not answer to submarine commanders. It answered to itself and to a decade of Depression-era budgets that had starved American weapons testing to the bone. Torpedoes were expensive. A single Mark 14 cost roughly $10,000 in 1930s money, and live-fire testing meant sending that money to the bottom of the ocean, one exercise at a time. Through most of the 1930s, the Bureau conducted only a handful of full test shots. Some sources placed the number of documented depth and detonation tests before the war at fewer than a dozen. A weapon meant to be fired thousands of times in combat had been proven, in practice, only a few dozen times on paper. This was not unique to the torpedo alone. It was the culture of the Bureau itself, an office where reputations were built on decisions already made, not decisions revisited. Admitting a flaw in the Mark 14 meant admitting a flaw in years of institutional judgment. And in the closed hierarchical world of naval ordnance in 1941, that kind of admission did not come easily, and it did not come from the top down. It would have to come from the bottom up, from the men who trusted the weapon with their lives, and who were about to discover ship by ship exactly how much that trust had cost. The Mark 14 was not built from nothing. It was an evolution, and that evolution is exactly where the trouble began. Its predecessor, the Mark 10, was a steam-powered torpedo dating back to the years after World War I. Reliable, well understood, but slow, short-ranged, and increasingly obsolete against faster, better armored ships. The Navy wanted something more lethal. In 1931, the Bureau of Ordnance began development on its replacement, a faster, longer-ranged weapon that would become the Mark 14. But speed and range were only half the ambition. The other half was secret and far more dangerous. Magnetic exploder, a detonating mechanism designed to sense the magnetic field of a steel ship's hull and fire the warhead as the torpedo passed directly beneath the keel, rather than waiting for a direct side-on impact. In theory, it meant a single torpedo could break a ship's back with one detonation, using the ocean itself to amplify the blast. It was based on classified research shared in part by the British Navy, and by 1931 the Bureau folded it directly into the Mark 14 program, codenamed the Mark 6 exploder. The idea was brilliant. The execution was never properly tested. Development ran through the early 1930s. Under tightening Depression-era naval budgets, the Bureau of Ordnance, operating with a fixed and shrinking allocation for live-fire testing, made a decision that would echo for a decade. Full war-shot testing of the Mark 14, firing a live, fully loaded torpedo at an actual target to confirm both depth-keeping and detonation, was conducted only a small handful of times before the weapon entered fleet service. By some accounts, as few as 2 or 3 live exercises with an actual warhead took place before 1941, out of budgetary necessity, rather than confidence in the design. Instead, The Bureau relied heavily on exercise torpedoes, dummy warheads, lighter than the real thing, fired to test speed and steering, but never to test whether the weapon would actually explode where it was supposed to, at the depth it was supposed to reach. A dummy warhead does not tell you if a live one will detonate. It does not tell you if a torpedo weighted with 800 pounds of Torpex explosive will run 6 feet deeper than its instruments claim. Nobody at the Bureau had confirmed, under the real combat conditions, that the Mark 14 would do the one thing a torpedo exists to do. By 1938, the weapon was standardized across the submarine fleet. Thousands were manufactured at the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, the sole facility producing the weapon, a bottleneck that would later slow any attempt to fix it. Each unit carried a price tag exceeding $10,000, a sum that made every commander who requested additional test shots sound to Bureau ears like a man asking to burn government money in the ocean for no good reason. The Mark 14 entered the war in December 1941 with an unblemished paper record, and almost no proof that the paper was telling the truth. December 1941. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins, and the United States Navy's battleship fleet had been gutted overnight. In the chaos that followed, one weapon suddenly carried the weight of the entire Pacific War effort: the submarine, and the torpedo slung beneath its bow. 51 American submarines were operational in the Pacific at the start of the war. Their mission was immediate and unambiguous: strangle Japan's supply lines, sink the freighters and tankers carrying oil, rubber, and troops across the Empire's vast maritime reach. Every commander who slipped out of Pearl Harbor or Fremantle that winter carried the same unspoken assumption: the Mark 14 and his torpedo tubes had been tested, approved, and proven by the Navy that built it. The first war patrols went out with that confidence intact. It did not survive contact with the enemy. Submarine after submarine returned from patrol with the same story, told in different words. A perfect firing solution, range calculated, angle confirmed, torpedo away, followed by nothing, no explosion. Sometimes the torpedo could be heard running past the target entirely, its wake visible but its detonator silent. Other times it struck dead center and simply failed to go off, the sound of impact carrying across open water like a hammer striking an anvil. And then silence. By early 1942, the pattern was no longer isolated. It was systemic. Commanders who had spent years training for this exact moment, stalking a target, closing the range, executing a textbook attack, were coming home from 6-week patrols having sunk nothing, despite firing spread after spread at ships sitting still in the water. One of the earliest and most damning reports came from a submarine patrolling near the Philippines in early 1942, whose commander fired 4 torpedoes at a stationary Japanese freighter from close range, a shot no submarine officer should have missed, and watched all 4 fail to detonate. He filed the report. Pearl Harbor filed it away. This was the beginning of the divide that would define the next 2 years of the war. Men in the water who trusted their instruments and their training, and an institution on shore that trusted its own paperwork more than the men reporting from the front lines. The submarine force had gone to war believing its weapon worked. What was coming next was the slow mounting realization, patrol by patrol, silence by silence, that it did not. By the summer of 1942, the evidence was no longer a scattering of unlucky patrols. It was a pattern documented in official war diaries, submitted by dozens of separate commanders who had never spoken to one another, describing the exact same failure in the exact same language. Torpedoes running deep. Torpedoes striking without exploding. Entire spreads missing targets that should have been unmissable. Some post-war analyses of these early war patrol reports would place the effective failure rate of the Mark 14 as high as 70% in certain engagements, a number that meant, in practical terms, that a submarine crew risking death to close within firing range of an enemy warship had worse than a coin flip's chance of actually sinking it. The Bureau of Ordnance's response was not to investigate the weapon. It was to investigate the man firing it. The official position communicated back down the chain to submarine squadrons throughout 1942 was that the Mark 14 had been thoroughly tested and approved, and that any failure to sink a target was, by process of elimination, the result of human error, poor firing solutions, incorrect depth settings entered by the crew, or simple lack of combat experience. Reportedly, some officers within the Bureau went further, suggesting that inexperienced wartime crews were prone to exaggerating both the accuracy of their shots and the failures that followed, unwilling to accept blame for a straightforward miss. From the Bureau's seat in Washington, this position was not entirely irrational. The Mark 14 had passed its approval process. Its designs had been reviewed by qualified engineers. Reversing course now would mean admitting that a weapon manufactured by the thousands, at enormous cost, across nearly a decade, was fundamentally broken. And that admission would not stay contained to a torpedo. It would raise questions about every decision the Bureau had made in the years the weapon was developed. But the men making that argument were sitting in offices in Washington. The men filing the reports were sitting in steel hulls beneath enemy destroyers, watching torpedoes they had aimed correctly disappear into silence. The gap between those two positions widened through the back half of 1942. Submarine commanders, professionals selected and trained for precisely this kind of technical, high-stakes work, began attaching increasingly detailed technical notes to their patrol reports, describing depth settings, target bearings, and torpedo behavior with a level of specificity meant to preempt exactly the accusation the Bureau kept making. It did not matter. The reports went back to Washington and returned, in effect, unchanged. Keep firing, keep aiming. The weapon is not the problem. The people dismissing the evidence did not yet understand what they were dismissing. They were not looking at isolated mistakes scattered across an inexperienced fleet. They were looking at the accumulated proof of a defect that had been sitting, unexamined, in a weapons program for over a decade. And the men closest to that proof were the ones with the least power to force anyone to listen. If Washington would not investigate its own weapon, the men firing it would investigate it themselves. In the summer of 1942, based out of Fremantle, Australia, a Navy captain named Charles Lockwood, at that point commanding submarine forces in the Southwest Pacific, not yet the man in charge of the entire fleet, grew tired of official reassurances that contradicted everything his commanders were telling him. He ordered an experiment the Bureau of Ordnance had never conducted in a decade of development. A live test to measure exactly how deep a Mark 14 actually ran, compared to the depth its operator had dialed in. Fishing nets were strung across Frenchman Bay, near the coastal town of Albany in Western Australia, hung in a vertical curtain from the surface down to well below the torpedo's programmed depth. A submarine fired a live torpedo directly through the net at a fixed, shallow setting. When the net was hauled back up, the tear in the mesh told the story that no amount of paperwork from Washington ever had. The torpedo had ripped through the net roughly 10 feet below where it had been set to run. 10 feet does not sound like much on paper. In the water, it was the difference between a torpedo passing harmlessly beneath a ship's keel and one striking the hull where it was aimed. A weapon set to run at a depth of 10 feet, shallow enough to catch a destroyer's thin draft, was in practice running at nearly 20, passing under its target every single time. It explained, in a single afternoon of testing with borrowed fishing gear, months of reports the Bureau had dismissed as bad aim. Lockwood forwarded the results up the chain. The response from Washington, by multiple accounts, was skepticism. The test conditions were questioned, the methodology criticized, the conclusion resisted. An improvised test using commercial fishing nets, conducted by a field commander without formal Bureau oversight, did not carry the institutional weight to overturn nearly a decade of official confidence. But Lockwood was not alone in refusing to accept the official line. Individual submarine commanders across the Pacific, increasingly convinced their weapon was defective and increasingly unwilling to risk their crews on faith alone, began running their own informal trials wherever operational conditions allowed, firing torpedoes at fixed underwater obstacles or rock formations to observe run depth and detonation behavior directly, comparing what they saw against what the torpedo's settings claimed it should do. These were not sanctioned experiments. They were desperate, resourceful men doing the Bureau of Ordnance's job for it, using cliff faces and coastlines, because the Navy that built the weapon had never bothered to prove it worked in the first place. The picture forming by late 1942 was no longer ambiguous to anyone actually fighting the war. The depth control mechanism was flawed. But depth was only the first problem. Even torpedoes running at the correct depth were still, in a significant number of cases, striking their targets and failing to explode. A second separate defect buried inside the magnetic exploder that no fishing net test could diagnose, proving that failure would require something the Bureau had never been willing to risk. An actual warhead, fired at an actual target, with someone willing to stake their career on being right. That someone was about to be given the authority to do exactly that. In February 1943, Charles Lockwood was promoted to Rear Admiral and given command of all United States submarine forces in the Pacific Fleet. It was, on paper, an administrative promotion. In practice, it put a man who had already spent a year distrusting the Mark 14 in direct control of the force that depended on it, and gave him for the first time the authority to force the issue the Bureau of Ordnance had spent nearly 2 years refusing to face. Lockwood inherited a submarine force that was, by this point, quietly furious. Patrol after patrol had returned with the same litany of failures, and morale among crews who risked their lives closing on enemy shipping only to hear a dud strike the hull was eroding fast. Some commanders had begun disabling the magnetic exploder feature entirely on their own initiative, reverting to simple contact detonation, a workaround that solved nothing for the deeper problem, but reflected how little faith remained in Washington's assurances. Lockwood's first move was procedural, not dramatic. He began systematically compiling every patrol report describing a torpedo failure, cross-referencing depth settings, target types, and firing conditions, building a body of evidence too large and too consistent to be waved away as scattered incompetence. But he had learned from the Frenchman Bay test the year before that data alone, without an undeniable physical demonstration, was not enough to move an institution defending a decade of its own decisions. So in June 1943, Lockwood ordered the test that Washington had never conducted in 10 years of developing the weapon, firing live, fully armed war-shot torpedoes, actual warheads, not exercise dummies, at a fixed target under controlled, observable conditions, specifically to measure both depth performance and the detonation reliability at once. The target chosen was a rock cliff face on the Hawaiian coastline, offshore from the island of Kahulawe. Solid, immovable, and capable of absorbing a live hit without endangering any vessel or crew. Submarines fired a series of war-shot torpedoes directly at the cliff, at known ranges and known depth settings, while observers tracked the torpedoes' actual behavior against their intended performance. The results were unambiguous in a way that no patrol report, however detailed, had ever been able to achieve from thousands of miles away. The torpedoes ran consistently deeper than their settings indicated, confirming, under fully controlled and fully documented conditions, exactly what the fishing net test at Frenchman Bay had suggested nearly a year earlier. This time there was no room to question the methodology. The target was fixed. The range was known. The instruments were calibrated. The evidence was physical, repeatable, and undeniable. Faced with a live-fire demonstration ordered by a rear admiral, commanding the entire Pacific submarine force, the Bureau of Ordnance could no longer maintain that the problem lay with the men in the boats. The depth control defect was formally acknowledged. Corrective adjustments to the torpedo's depth mechanism began moving through the fleet within weeks, a fix that could, in truth, have been identified and implemented at any point in the preceding decade with a fraction of the testing effort the Bureau had refused to fund. But depth was never the whole story, and Lockwood knew it. Torpedoes now running true to their intended depth were still failing to detonate on impact in a troubling number of engagements. The magnetic exploder, and the contact firing pin beneath it, remained unproven and unreliable. Even after the depth fix took hold, the cliff test had answered one question. It had not answered the one that mattered just as much. Why were torpedoes that struck their targets squarely still refusing to explode? That investigation would take the rest of 1943 to complete, conducted under Lockwood's continued pressure and involving engineers, finally willing to test the exploder mechanism under realistic combat conditions, rather than theoretical ones. It would reveal a design flaw in the firing pin, one that caused the detonator to jam or fail specifically on the kind of square 90-degree hits that should have produced the most reliable explosions of all. The exact shots submarine commanders had been making and reporting as failures for the better part of 2 years. By the time both defects were finally corrected, the Mark 14 had been in fleet service for 5 years and at war for nearly 2. Charles Lockwood had done, with a handful of live torpedoes fired at a Hawaiian cliff, what the Bureau of Ordnance's own testing program had failed to do in a decade of peacetime development: prove, beyond argument, that the weapon did not work as designed. The question that remained was not technical. It was moral. How many ships had escaped? How many patrols had returned empty? And how many submariners had died pressing dangerously close to targets that a functioning torpedo would have sunk from a safer range, all while the fix sat within reach, waiting only for someone with enough authority to demand the proof Washington had refused to seek? The repairs, once finally underway, moved in careful sequence, not because the engineering was complicated, but because each fix had to be proven correct before the next problem could even be properly isolated. The depth control mechanism came first, corrected through the second half of 1943 following the Kahulawe test, calibrated so that a torpedo set to run at a given depth would actually run at that depth, not several feet below it. This alone should have been resolved through routine testing years before the war began. Instead, it took a rear admiral, a rock cliff, and live warheads to force the correction that basic peacetime diligence should have caught in 1938. The second fix targeted the magnetic exploder itself. Even after depth performance improved, the exploder mechanism remained unreliable, oversensitive in some conditions, causing premature detonation before the torpedo reached the target, and inert in others, failing to trigger at all. Facing mounting pressure and undeniable evidence, the Bureau of Ordnance made the decision, by late 1943, to disable the magnetic feature across the fleet entirely, reverting the Mark 14 to a simpler contact-only detonation system. The exact workaround individual commanders had already been improvising without authorization for months. The third and final defect was the most mechanically embarrassing of all. Engineers examining the contact detonator discovered that the firing pin, the small mechanical component meant to strike the primer and set off the main charge, tended to deform or jam on square direct hits, precisely the kind of 90-degree broadside strike that represented the cleanest, most well-executed shot a submarine commander could make. The better the shot, the more likely the torpedo was to fail. A redesigned firing pin, lighter and less prone to jamming on impact, was developed and rolled into production through the final months of 1943. By the close of that year, nearly 2 years after the war began, the Mark 14 finally performed as its designers had always claimed it did. The cost of that delay is difficult to state in a single number because it was paid in 2 currencies at once. The first was material, entire war patrols throughout 1942, and much of 1943 that returned to port having expended dozens of torpedoes against enemy shipping with little or nothing to show for it. Japanese freighters and tankers that sailed on to deliver oil, troops, and war material, because the weapons fired at them simply did not work. Post-war analyses of early war patrol data would estimate that a majority of torpedo attacks during this period failed to sink their intended target, a failure rate that, had it been corrected even a year earlier, could plausibly have shortened Japan's ability to sustain its Pacific supply lines by a comparable margin. The second currency was paid in lives, and it is the harder one to calculate with precision. Submarine warfare demanded closing to dangerously short range to guarantee a hit, exposing the boat and its crew to counterattack for longer than a reliable weapon would have required. Some historians have argued that the extended exposure forced on crews by an unreliable torpedo, the repeated attacks needed to compensate for repeated failures, contributed directly to submarine losses during this period, losses that a functioning weapon might have prevented by ending engagements faster and from safer distances. No official report will ever assign an exact number of American submariners lost specifically to a defective detonator rather than enemy action, but the men who served through those 2 years understood the connection without needing a Bureau report to confirm it for them. The weapon that finally reached the fleet in early 1944 was, by every measure, the torpedo the Navy had always claimed to have built. It had simply taken 2 years of war, a fishing net in Frenchman Bay, and a cliff face off Kahulawe to prove it. With the Mark 14 finally fixed, the American submarine force did not simply recover. It transformed into the most efficient instrument of maritime destruction in the Pacific War. Through 1944 and into 1945, submarines that had once returned from 6-week patrols with nothing to show for their risk began sinking Japanese shipping at a rate that historians would later credit as decisive to the war's outcome. American submarines, representing a small fraction of the Navy's total personnel, were responsible for sinking a majority of Japan's merchant marine tonnage lost during the entire war, cutting off the oil, rubber, and raw materials an island empire needed simply to keep fighting. The same boats, the same crews, and in many cases the same torpedo tubes that had failed so consistently in 1942 became, within 2 years, the weapon that starved Japan's war machine from beneath the waves. The irony sits at the center of the story and does not require embellishment. The technology that helped win the Pacific War was not a wartime invention. It had existed since before Pearl Harbor. What had been missing was never engineering. It was the willingness of an institution to test its own certainty against the evidence in front of it. The honest verdict on the Bureau of Ordnance is neither simple villainy nor forgivable oversight. Its engineers had not acted with malice. They had acted within a Depression-era budget that made every test shot a luxury. Inside a culture where admitting fault meant admitting years of accumulated institutional judgment had been wrong. That is not an excuse. It is the mechanism by which an entire Navy convinced itself, for the better part of 2 years, that its own weapon could not possibly be the problem, because the alternative was too costly to consider, in money and in pride, until it became too costly to ignore in lives. Charles Lockwood's name is remembered in naval history specifically because he refused that logic. He did not invent the Mark 14. He did not design its exploder or its firing pin. What he did was simpler and, in its own way, harder. He trusted the men reporting from combat over the paperwork sitting in Washington, and he was willing to stake his command on proving it with a torpedo and a cliff face when official channels would not. The submarine force that emerged from this crisis went on to serve as a template for how the U.S. Navy approached weapons testing for the rest of the 20th century, a hard-earned institutional memory that combat reports from the field carry a weight no peacetime budget review can substitute for. It is a lesson written not in a policy manual, but in the 2 years it took to learn it, and in the ships that were not sunk while it went unlearned. The Bureau tested the torpedo on paper. The war tested it in blood.